Black women seeking to assert the rights of citizenship and freedom after emancipation faced dangers based on their race and sex, just as they had for generations while enslaved. Black women were killed in the same lynchings and mass killings that took the lives of black men, but they were also more likely to suffer the trauma of sexual violence. In May 1870, 15 white men raped a black woman, while other members of the mob lynched her husband. Days later, in the same North Carolina community, another white mob raped a black woman and afterwards stuck their knives in various parts of her body. News of incidents like these spread through the entire African American community, devastating black women with the terror of their dual vulnerability. In the tapestry of American history, threads of injustice run dark and deep. Among them, none lie more deeply woven than the brutal stain of slavery, particularly the untold narrative of the black female slave's experience. It's a narrative woven with blood and tears, with whispers choked by fear and silenced by shame. Yet, it's a story that demands to be unraveled, not out of morbid fascination, but out of a profound need for truth and reckoning. Imagine, if you will, a world where sunlight becomes a searing spotlight, highlighting not fields of cotton, but a stage for unspeakable horror, where the whip that cracks against bare backs becomes a chilling metronome, marking the rhythm of stolen lives, where motherhood is not a cradle of comfort, but a crucible of unimaginable pain. Imagine, if you will, a world where the color of your skin and the sex you were born with pronounce you not as a human being but as a vessel of suffering. A world where the whip wasn't just a tool of labor, but a grim instrument of subjugation, wielded with impunity against bodies already burdened by forced servitude. This was the reality for countless black women during the era of American slavery. This video delves into the abyss of abuse faced by black female slaves at the hands of white men, not as a morbid spectacle, but as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. I welcome you, therefore, to yet another interesting episode on the untold abuse of black female slaves by white men. If you dare to face the darkness, to peel back the layers of history, and expose the wounds that fester still, come. Let us venture together into the untold, step beyond the sanitized accounts, the comfortable distance of textbooks, and confront the raw, unfiltered truth. Don't forget to support our efforts too by hitting the like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means the world to us. Enslaved black women had no legal means to resist or protect themselves from sexual assault by white slave owners. As early as the 1830s, black abolitionist Maria Stewart called for the law to recognize black women as full humans with rights to control their bodies and to grant or withhold consent, but reality lagged far behind. In Missouri, in 1855, a young enslaved black woman named Celia was convicted of murder and hanged for killing a white man who had enslaved and repeatedly raped her. The court rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that enslaved black women had no right to resist white slave owners' sexual advances. White Southerners were determined to maintain the economic exploitation and political dominance they had enjoyed during slavery, and white men refused to relinquish their freedom to violate black women with impunity. Even before the Civil War's end, Southern state legislatures implemented laws providing different sexual protections to white women and black women. The Georgia Code of 1861 specified a mandatory sentencing range for raping a white woman, but let courts decide whether and how to punish rapes of black women. Indifferent and complicit law enforcement officers undermined federal attempts to protect black women. In October 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent delivered arrest warrants for 2 white men accused of beating a black woman named Sylvie Solean and killing her son, but the local Louisiana sheriff refused to arrest them. That summer in Louisiana, Bureau records reveal an even more devastating story. Captain N.B. Blanton, Sparta, reports Cuff Canara, Freedman, and Dan Docking, white, had a quarrel because Docking had twice committed a rape on the freedman's wife. Canara, started to agent of Bureau, was tracked by hounds for 10 miles and fired on by Dan Docking, Norman Docking, and John Palmer. Shot in the left side of the back and had finally reached the agent, having killed 3 out of 4 of the dogs. Warrants issued for the arrest of parties, but they have not been found. And from the statement of people who do not think they will be arrested, the people appear to think the freedman had committed the greater crime by killing the dogs than the man who shot him. Scholar Estelle Friedman writes that white people deepened the association of rape as an act committed by a black man against a white woman during Reconstruction, and presumed that black women either welcomed forced sexual relations with white men or had no moral purity to defend. The same white men who professed a fanatical concern for white women's purity and safety held tightly to the social and legal view of black women as promiscuous, lacking virtue, and without the right to refuse the lust of any white man. This particular narrative of racial difference shielded white men from shame and consequence when they employed sexual assault as yet another means of terrorizing black communities during Reconstruction. In 1868, after a white Virginia judge was accused of assaulting a black woman, he tried the case himself, jailed the woman overnight, and forced her husband to pay court fees. On the 30th of June 1866, also in Virginia, a black woman named Peggy Rich reported that a white man named James Smith had assaulted her. He attacked Ms. Rich again after he was released on bail and was later acquitted of both charges. In September 1866, a black woman named Rhoda Ann Childs reported to the Freedmen's Bureau that 8 white planters had come to her Georgia home demanding to see her husband. When they learned Mrs. Childs was alone, the men kidnapped, beat, and sexually assaulted her. Mrs. Childs's affidavit describes that one of the men ran his pistol into her and said he had a hell of a mind to pull the trigger. And several of the men restrained her, while one applied the strap to her private parts until fatigued into stopping. And I was more dead than alive, she said. After another of the men, a former Confederate soldier, raped Mrs. Childs, the mob robbed her home and beat her daughters. In 1871, Harriet Simrell testified before a joint congressional committee that 3 white men had raped her in Columbia, South Carolina, after her husband refused to vote for the white supremacist ticket. In a courageous statement to federal lawmakers, Ms. Simrell named her attackers and described their brutality, spitting in my face and throwing dirt in my eyes. And after that, they dragged me out into the big road, and they ravished me out there. The details of the attack were deemed too obscene for inclusion in the committee's published volumes. But the defiant courage Ms. Simrell and so many other black women exhibited in reporting such attacks stand as enduring evidence of the sexualized terror black women suffered during Reconstruction and their determination to survive. Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861, phenomenally described the dynamics of the relationship between many female slaves and their superiors. With these words from her personal narrative, he told me that I was made for his use, made to obey his command in everything, that I was nothing but a slave, whose will must and should surrender to his. The intrinsically racist ideas of antebellum white slaveholders led them to regard their enslaved people as both biologically and culturally inferior to themselves. And because they held such views, they frequently beat, whipped, or otherwise physically mistreated enslaved women under their control, especially when enslavers felt the women were not working hard enough or reproducing as often as they demanded. Enslaved women were given to white women as gifts from their husbands and as wedding and Christmas gifts. Slaveholders' exploitation of their female chattel took multiple forms. Aside from physical and sexual violence, white men also abused bonded women's bodies in the name of medical science to further their own careers. The idea that New England masters treated their slaves with greater kindness in comparison to Southern slave owners is a myth. They had little mobility freedom and lacked access to education and any training. The record of slaves who were branded by their owners, had their ears nailed, fled, committed suicide, suffered the dissolution of their families, or were sold secretly to new owners in Barbados in the last days of the Revolutionary War before they become worthless, seems sufficient to refute the myth of kindly masters. They lashed out at their slaves when they were angry, filled with rage, or had convenient access to horsewhip. Female slaves were sometimes forced by their masters into sexual relationships with enslaved men for the purpose of forced breeding. It was also not uncommon for enslaved women to be raped and, in most cases, impregnated by their masters. Many female slaves were the object of severe sexual exploitation, often bearing the children of their white masters, masters' sons, or overseers. Slaves were prohibited from defending themselves against any type of abuse, including sexual, at the hands of white men. If a slave attempted to defend herself, she was often subjected to further beatings by the master, or even by the mistress. White women, of course, saw what was happening between their husbands and the enslaved women ostensibly under their care. The more literate ones had at some point expressed their anger in writing. One of them was Mary Boykin Chestnut, a wealthy South Carolina woman whose husband was first a U.S. senator and then a Confederate officer. But what do you say to this? To a magnate who runs a hideous black harem with its consequences, under the same roof with his lovely white wife and his beautiful and accomplished daughters, Mary had asked in her diary. He holds his head high and poses as the model of all human virtues to these poor women whom God and the laws have given him. Mary Boykin Chestnut, from March 31, 1823 to November 22, 1886, was an American author noted for a book published as her Civil War Diary, a vivid picture of a society in the throes of its life and death struggle. She described the war from within her upper-class circles of Southern slave owner society, but encompassed all classes in her book. She was married to James Chestnut, Jr., a lawyer who served as a United States Senator and officer in the Confederate States Army. Mary Chestnut was an eyewitness to many historic events as she accompanied her husband to significant sites of the American Civil War. She was aware of the historical importance of what she witnessed. Chestnut analyzed and portrayed the various classes of the South throughout the war, providing a detailed view of Southern society, and especially of the mixed roles of men and women. She was forthright about the complex and fraught situations related to slavery, particularly the abuses of women's sexuality and the power exercised by white men. For instance, Chestnut discussed the problem of white slave owners fathering mixed-race children with enslaved women within their extended households. Because Virginia's passage of the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum had established that children were born into the status of their mother, many mixed-race children were among the enslaved. The doctrine was a departure from English common law, which required fathers to take responsibility for illegitimate children. Southern women would often marry a man knowing that he is the father of many little slaves. They do not trouble themselves about it, Harriet Jacobs wrote. They regard such children as property, as marketable as the pigs on the plantation. And it is seldom that they do not make them aware of this by passing them into the slave traders' hands as soon as possible, and thus getting them out of their sight. Jacobs noted that there were some honorable exceptions, but less scrupulous men could increase their net worth by selling their own children or putting them to work. Ned and Constance Sublette, authors of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry, coined the term capitalized womb in trying to describe this dynamic. For the sake of brevity, just think of slaves as money and their offspring as interest. Before slavery was outlawed, it was not uncommon for young female slaves to be sexually abused and exploited by their masters. Although many people know about the cruelty of the sexual assaults that made too many young black girls victims of rape in the antebellum South, most people are unaware of the complexity of the issue and how many different ways these women were abused. For instance, the power and authority given to overseers on plantations in the antebellum South often led to a misuse of power, particularly in regards to enslaved young women. Overseers were slaves chosen by their masters to control the fields on bigger plantations to keep the slaves in line and on task. However, sometimes this power led to abuse. Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman? Details the grueling experiences of the African-American female slaves on Southern plantations. Deborah resented the fact that African-American women were nearly invisible throughout historical text, because many historians failed to see them as important contributors to America's social, economic, or political development. Despite limited historical sources, she was determined to establish the African-American woman as an intricate part of American history. and thus she had first published her novel in 1985. However, the novel has since been revised to include newly revealed sources that have been worked into the novel. Aren't I a Woman presents African-American females' struggle. The term Jezebel, a seductive female slave concerned only with matters of the flesh, was used as a means of excusing miscegenation, the sexual exploitation of African-American women, and the mulatto population. The term Mammy, the premier house servant with expertise in all domestic matters, and known for the loving way she raised the master's children, was used to symbolize race and sex relations at their best. The image of Mammy justified slavery for many white Southerners, for she reflected a positive idea that slaves somehow benefited from the institution of slavery. Deborah White explores the master's sexual exploitation of their female slaves and proves this method of oppression to be the defining factor of what sets the female slaves apart from their male counterparts. Citing former slaves, White writes, Christopher Nichols, an escaped slave living in Canada, remembered how his master laid a woman on a bench, threw her clothes over her head, and whipped her. The whipping of a 13-year-old Georgia slave girl also had sexual overtones. The girl was put on all fours, sometimes her head down and sometimes up, and beaten until froth ran from her mouth. The girl's forced bodily position, as well as her total helplessness to stop her master's torture, blatantly reveals the intensely forced sexual trauma many African females endured. The difficulties of black female slaves would normally begin early from their childhood. Black females, some of them children, were forced into sexual relationships for their white owner's pleasure and profit, attempting to keep the slave population growing by his own doing and not by importing more slaves from Africa. Even Thomas Jefferson, a one-time American statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect, philosopher, and founding father, who served as the third president of the United States from 1801 to 1809, is believed to have fathered 6 mixed-race children. 4 survived to adulthood, with one of his female slaves, Sally Hemings, a woman 3/4 white and half-sister to his late wife, who served as the widower's concubine for more than 2 decades. In the case of Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, her enslaver, Dr. James Norcom, had sexually harassed her for years. Even after she had 2 children of her own, he threatened to sell them if she denied his sexual advances. Although Harriet Jacobs managed to escape to the North with her children, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 still put their freedom at risk due to Dr. Norcom's family continuing to pursue her. Women knew that enslavers valued and depended upon their ability to bear children and increase the slave population. With this understanding, enslaved women participated in acts of resistance specific to the labor demanded of them. From avoiding sexual intercourse to terminating pregnancy to taking the lives of their own infants, some women resisted slavery by working to control their participation in producing more enslaved children. New mothers risked eventual separation from their children, and if they had daughters, they knew any sexual violence they had experienced could become their daughter's experience as well. Women used this kind of resistance, therefore, to combat slaveholders' control over their own bodies and protect their potential children from the horrors of bondage. At the most extreme end of the spectrum of enslaved women's day-to-day resistance lay infanticide, taking the life of one's own children rather than raise them enslaved. Infanticide speaks to slavery's horrific violence, pain, and trauma, and while some historians have perceived the practice as a form of resistance that operated within the system rather than by leaving it, along with suicide, infanticide conveys that some enslaved people tragically saw death as the only escape from bondage. They simply saw no future worth enduring. Overall, however, historical evidence suggests infanticide was a very rare action taken by mothers, in part because enslavers might have mistaken infanticide for other forms of infant death, and also because women who took their own children's lives would have faced severe punishment, even death, for committing these acts. The most famous example of infanticide was the case Margaret Garner, who took the life of her own daughter when caught trying to flee bondage with her children. Women also used their knowledge of plants and medicine, knowledge passed down generationally, as a means of preventing pregnancy and attempting to induce abortions. Medicinal herbs were also used by the slave community to regulate menstrual cycles and assist in births. Their gender-specific knowledge and cultural practices resisted dominant cultural norms. Women's actions also provided empowerment and control over their bodies. On cotton plantations throughout the South, including Sea Island cotton plantations in the Low Country, women chewed cotton roots to prevent pregnancy or end a pregnancy already in progress. Once free to discuss these secretive forms of women's resistance, formerly enslaved people across the South and Southwest discussed the commonness of deliberate abortions among the enslaved population. Many slaveholders therefore forbade women from possessing cotton roots, and when they discovered enslaved women chewing or storing cotton roots, women paid for their resistance with violent beatings. Beyond cotton root, women possessed knowledge of other tinctures as abortifacients. WPA respondent Lou Lee spoke of how enslaved women tried to induce abortions to end unwanted pregnancies. They unfixed themselves by taking calomel and turpentine. In them days, the turpentine was strong and 10 or 12 drops would miscarry you. But the makers found what it was used for, and they changed the way of making turpentine. It ain't no good no more, Lou Lee Rowick says in The American Slave, Supplement Series 2, Westport, Conjurse, Greenwood Press, 1979. Women also used herbs and tinctures to regulate their menstrual cycle in order to better track when pregnancy was possible. They also breastfed, sometimes against the slaveholders' demands to stop, in hopes of lessening the chance of becoming pregnant. While avoiding or ending a pregnancy was a regular form of resistance, enslaved women may have also deceived plantation owners into believing they were pregnant to lessen their workload. Low-country agricultural journals indicate that slave owners and overseers cut pregnant women's daily tasks in half and recommended they keep them out of wet areas, as they would want their newborns, that is, their incoming slaves or properties, to be healthy and capable enough for exploitation. Reproductive resistance among enslaved women illustrates how enslaved women sought to challenge and defy their enslavers in whatever ways they could. The efficacy of their resistance varied depending on the method. However, enslaved women's decision to avoid or limit their number of pregnancies reveals their commitment to caring for their own bodies and controlling if and when to bring children into the system they endured. In addition, forced labor was the central activity in enslaved women's lives. Working for enslavers took up the great majority of all enslaved people's time. Their work was simultaneously arduous and monotonous, but also filled with the risk of physical and sexual violence. In the Low Country, characterized by its large rice and Sea Island cotton plantations, the majority of enslaved women toiled in the fields, following yearly agricultural cycles in tending the crops. Enslaved women largely occupied traditional women's work roles and were often hired out by the day. They worked mainly as maids in the kitchen, the barn, and the garden. They did menial and servile tasks, polished family silver or furniture, helped with clothes and hair, drew baths, barbered the men, and completed menial domestic chores like sweeping, emptying chamber pots, carrying gallons of water on a daily basis, washing the dishes, brewing, looking after young children and the elderly, cooking and baking, milking the cows, feeding the chickens, spinning, knitting, carding, sewing, and laundering. Regardless, their daily work was less demanding than the field labor of enslaved women in other regions. Nonetheless, enslaved women in New England worked hard, often under poor living conditions and malnutrition. As a result of heavy work, poor housing conditions, and inadequate diet, the average black woman did not live past 40. Enslaved women, like their male counterparts, typically began to work for slaveholders at a very young age as quarter hands. These young girls performed small chores such as picking up trash, caring for younger children, cleaning cotton before it was ginned, or scaring birds away from newly sown rice seeds from the age of around just 5 years old. At adolescence, most enslaved girls began to labor on a more systematic basis. Although fieldwork was traditionally considered to be men's work, different estimates conclude that between 63% and 80% of women worked in the fields, as adult female work depended greatly upon plantation size. On small farms, women and men performed similar tasks. while on larger plantations, males were given more physically demanding work. Slave girls in North America often worked within the domestic sphere, providing household help. White families sought the help of a girl, an all-purpose tool in family life. Although the word girl applied to any working female without children, slaves were preferred because in the long run, they cost less. These enslaved girls were usually very young, anywhere from 9 years of age to their mid-teens. Heavy household work was assigned to the girl and was therefore stigmatized as Negro's work. A girl was an essential source of help to white families, rural and urban, middle class and aspiring. She provided freedom for the daughters of her master to devote themselves to their self-development and relieved mothers from exhausting labor while requiring no financial or emotional maintenance, no empathy. To ignore the untold abuse of black female slaves by white men is to bury ourselves in willful amnesia. For too long, their stories were stolen, their voices silenced, their pain dismissed. No more. We reclaim their narrative, weave it into the very fabric of our being. We break the chains of silence, speak their names with reverence, and honor their resistance. They were not simply victims, but warriors, their spirit forged in the crucible of suffering. They built families, nurtured communities, held onto hope against all odds. Though their bodies were shackled, their spirits soared. Though their voices were silenced, their resilience echoed across generations. From the fields of cotton to the boardrooms of power, their daughters rose, their granddaughters marched, their legacy a living flame. Let their untold stories fuel our fight for a world where black women stand tall, their voices ringing like freedom bells, their wounds acknowledged, their triumphs celebrated. Their strength has become our beacon, their legacy our compass. We celebrate their lives, not in pity, but in awe. We carry their burdens, not with despair, but with determination. We must confront this legacy, not with flinching eyes, but with unflinching resolve. Let this be the day we rewrite the narrative, not as slaves, but as survivors, as ancestors, as the architects of our own destiny. May their stories become anthems of hope, forever echoing in the hearts of those who dare to dream of a just tomorrow. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Share with us in the comment section below concerning what you think about these findings. We're always delighted to know what your thoughts are. Don't forget also to support our endeavors by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative. And kindly subscribe to help build the rising membership of this channel. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching.